James, it looks like we are well and truly into this thing. We're talking, possibly 7-month campaign here.
Yeah, I was reflecting on that earlier, Kieran, the unofficial kickoffs of election campaigns. It kind of reminds me a little of board games as a kid, where if someone doesn't get a good roll of the die, they say, oh, that one's just a practice round. And then after a few practice rounds, when they roll a double or six, so actually, let's just keep going. This is the real thing. I feel like the PM is searching for that double six of the roll of the dice. You may recall there was that speculation that he might use his triumphant return from Glasgow as a springboard into a possible December poll. Obviously, things didn't play out like that, so now he's looking for the next one. So, and obviously, at some point too, he'll run out of unofficial campaigns and we'll be into the real one eventually.
Indeed. It was interesting, Fiona, just a couple of weeks ago, the Prime Minister mentioned in a news conference where he said, we'll be having a budget. I think that was that emissions reduction plan from memory. And by indicating there'll be a budget, suggesting to us, well, we're not going to a March election or even December, as James said, was a possibility, but now likely May.
Yeah, look, Kieran, I've always been firmly in the camp of a May election, and the Prime Minister has actually been quite clear about this since he won nearly 3 years ago. He said he was going full term. He's going full term. Anyone who's saying otherwise has clearly not been listening to the Prime Minister or watching the tea leaves. For a long time, he had been wanting to go to Glasgow. The Prime Minister has also said a couple of things that, for instance, in the last election, he felt things like Anzac Day and the Easter break was also a really positive thing into the campaign period. So look, my odds are that the election will be the end of April or the beginning of May, because that potentially brings both Easter and Anzac Day into the election period.
James, it looks like the election all about the economy, according to Josh Frydenberg. Obviously, political 101 for coalitions are that they want to argue and fight on the economy. I'll be joined by the Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers just after the top of the hour. But for Labor, is that a vulnerability once again, or do you think that they can counter this economic argument once delivered this time by the coalition and Prime Minister Morrison?
Yeah, I'm not convinced it'll be as straightforward as the government might be hoping. I mean, we do know the polling tends to show that the voters do tend to associate the coalition with strong economic management, but typically that's been a close association with budget surpluses and with the fiscal narrative that the coalition has effectively claimed the economic mantle with gone out the window, and that's not all their fault. It's the circumstances, so it's not me having a gripe there. It just changes how you frame the economic debate, because the ability to talk about it is just simply a matter of who's going to deliver a budget surplus is not there for that simple message that they've usually relied upon.
The other point that has been a tradition in recent years, Fiona, is the coalition warning about the risk of Labor. Yesterday, Chris Bowen not ruling out changing the safeguard mechanism. It gets a bit esoteric when we get down to talking about the safeguard mechanism, government warning it's going to be some sort of tax. Are they at a risk if they try and reheat previous elections on climate change as well, Fiona?
Well, the thing about climate change, Kieran, it's a little bit like the borders and asylum seekers debates. I mean, these things do get recycled at every election, and some elections they win and some elections they don't necessarily have traction. But look, from my experience, people vote for what's important for them, what affects their hip pocket, what is going to matter to them. I mean, we saw that with all of the rhetoric in the last election around things like the franking dividends and all of that sort of stuff, where the older community felt that was going to affect their life savings. James makes a point. Labor has no ground to go on here. They can't hit and tack the coalition on running the economy, because, sure, for a couple of quarters there, we did hit a recession because we were locked down in COVID. However, Josh Frydenberg and the Prime Minister has managed to really keep the Australian economy ticking well above most of our like economies, like most of the other parts around the world. So not only have we come through the COVID period with one of the lowest death rates, but also one of the highest performances of any of the developed economies. And so the coalition actually has a very, very strong mantle to go on. The Labor Party, on the other hand, would talk about that they would have increased spending by so much more, that the debt that they would have got us into would have been so much more. Kieran, I think the most interesting thing will be from now until Christmas, when we hit MyEFO and what will be in that MyEFO, because MyEFO really is going to be that pre-election budget. Where are all the little, pots of money that's hidden, and what are going to come out of MyEFO, because I think that will really set us up for what is this election going to be about.
Indeed. Obviously, there's an expectation as well that they might have another April budget, James. If you look at further to what Fiona's saying, though, in terms of the federal response, this election is unique in the way that the state premiers have been elevated so much, like in McGowan, Palaszczuk in Queensland, particularly McGowan, with those borders set to remain closed into next year. It's an uncertainty, isn't it, for the government, or in fact for both sides, to manage?
Yeah, that's right, Kieran. It is a conundrum for the government. Even watching a bit of the PM's press conference, he highlights the low death rate, largely due to the state lockdowns that were imposed on him. He highlights the high vaccination rate, which is not something that he was in a rush to achieve in the first place. So he is inviting if all these things are the ingredients to our strong recovery, imagine how we'd be doing if we didn't have him in the way, is kind of the invitation he's inviting from people in terms of the comparison for how strong a recovery would be if we actually had someone who got things right from the start.
Fiona, one of the challenges, if you pick up with what James said there, that Scott Morrison faces at this election is, and this is just simply because he's been there longer, is that Labor's got a lot more to work with in terms of their advertising and whatever else. I mean, whether you love Scott Morrison or you don't, once you're in a job for a longer period of time, including the top job, there's just more fodder for the other side to whip into advertising. And I've got to say, Labor's advertising in the last campaign was like a wet lettuce. It was terrible. But so they can only improve on that, can't they?
Yeah, and Labor's, advertising in 2016 with Mediscare was very effective. So, I mean, I think you see it ebb and flow, that sometimes the sides get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. But look, I think the other thing to watch is how some of those states are going to go. I mean, for instance, Western Australia and Queensland. I mean, for me, I think Queensland is very much at a high watermark, so are there more seats to win there? Whereas, I actually respectfully disagree with Richo that, look, the coalition has a lot of seats to win here in New South Wales. I don't think we're going to lose seats in New South Wales. I think there's seats like getting Hughes back with Melanie Gibbons, getting Gilmore with Andrew Constance, how close the seat, the most marginal seat in the country, seat right next to where I live, Macquarie in the Blue Mountains, and of course the Prime Minister today up in the Hunter Valley, looking at those three key seats, obviously Shortland and Patterson for the Liberal Party, and the seat, and Joel Fitzgibbon's seat of Hunter with the Nats. So look, there's a lot of work for the coalition to do in New South Wales, but of course the vulnerability is going to be Western Australia and Queensland, and with the behaviour of Palaszczuk and McGowan, how is Morrison going to go in those two states?
Yep, that's one of the key unknowns. Fiona, thank you. James, good to see you. We'll chat soon.